Today is week number 3 in this series called Escape. During this teaching series, we've been talking about the temptations, the habits, and even the addictions that can take control of our lives and hold us hostage. We're also talking about how to escape from the grip of those addictions. But along with talking about addiction, we also want to provide practical solutions to this problem. One way we're doing that is through a financial gift our church has made to a new program from the Right Center called Healthy Moms. The Healthy Moms program works with pregnant women who are struggling with addiction. They offer services such as health care and addiction recovery, legal and employment assistance. They do all of that so that a woman in their care can build a stable life and deliver a healthy baby. Our financial gift to Healthy Moms will provide emergency housing for women in this program who don't have a safe place to live. This gift was made possible by hundreds of Parker Hill families who are participating in our 3-year generosity challenge called 4NEPA. Hundreds of Parker Hill families have made a commitment to go above and beyond their normal giving to send a message to our community, the message that we are for them, not against them. I'm here with Maria Montoro and Maria Colcharno, and they administer the Healthy Moms program, and we are excited to partner with them in the great work that they're doing here in northeastern Pennsylvania.
We are so appreciative of Parker Hill's gift of housing support for the Healthy Moms program because we know that without a solid foundation of housing, nothing else is possible. So we are tremendously appreciative for your investment in this program, and we know the impact will be great.
One of the families that we've most recently been dealing with have been living in a hotel for a matter of a couple weeks, ran out of money. As the donation comes across, they're going to be able to pay their rent for a couple months, and the baby's due in 2 weeks, so it's awesome. Just a wonderful gift that the church has offered us.
Awesome. Because of your generosity, we were able to give a gift of $25,000 to the Healthy Moms program. Because of your generosity, there will be women in our community who find freedom from addiction and have children who are born healthy. And because of your generosity, the love of Christ will be seen more clearly here in northeastern Pennsylvania. Thank you. Let me say just one more big thank you to everyone who's a part of our 4NEPA initiative. I believe only eternity will tell the full story of how your generosity is changing lives and advancing God's kingdom. So thank you, thank you, thank you. If you're not yet a part of that, you can be. Just go on our website and check out 4NEPA. Hey, great to have you guys here with us today. This is week number 3 in this teaching series called Escape. And we're talking about the temptations and the habits and even the addictions that can grab hold of us and hold us hostage, and how we can escape from those things. And during this series, this has been our definition of addiction. We're describing it this way: addiction is running back to what hurts you for help. And there's just something about us as human beings that causes us to do this. We run toward things for help and comfort and satisfaction that just end up hurting us. And when we talk about addiction, we're not just talking about drug addiction and alcohol addiction. Certainly those are some of the most destructive forms of addiction, but there are many forms of addiction. You can be addicted, I believe, to food. You run to that to find your comfort. People can be addicted to buying and shopping. You know, you feel bad about yourself, and so you do a little bit of retail therapy. You buy something and you feel better. Then you get the credit card bill and you feel bad, so you buy something so you feel better, and we run back to what hurts us. Could be pornography. Could be gambling, all kinds of things that we run to seeking to fill something inside of us that just end up hurting us or sometimes even trapping us. So as I was thinking about the subject of addiction, I remembered a news story from last year. There was a black bear cub that weighed about 100 pounds that got its head caught in a plastic container. Okay, yeah, it turns out fine. I'll tell you the rest of the story in a minute, but he gets his head caught in this plastic container. This was one of those containers like when you go to Sam's Club and you buy the orange cheese balls. That's what this was. So he gets his head stuck in there, and it probably would have killed him if someone hadn't seen him wandering around with this thing on his head, and they called the Pennsylvania Game Commission. And so the Game Commission tracked him for 3 days and then found him, and they tranquilized him. Then they took the container off his head, and he woke up, and he was fine, and they set him free, and everything's good, and he'll probably tell his grandkids all about this story that he had, you know. But when I saw that picture, I thought, that right there, that is a picture of how habits and addictions work in our lives. That little bear smelled something, and he went looking in that container for something to satisfy his hunger, and he ended up being trapped by it. And I think almost every addiction begins there. It begins with some internal hunger, some desire to satisfy a need, some inner longing, or trying to find a way to deal with some inner pain. And then we go toward that thing that we think will satisfy us, and it just ends up trapping us. I got an email a couple of weeks ago after we started this series from a young lady who's struggling with her own addiction. And there was one sentence in this email that really stood out to me. She said this. She said, "I turn to alcohol so I can feel numb. And all I really want is to feel loved." And I think that's the story of almost every addiction, at least where it begins. We're looking to fill something on the inside, to satisfy some hunger, but we run to all the wrong things, and they end up trapping us or destroying us. And this has been the story of the human race, literally for centuries. Like hundreds of years ago, the prophet Isaiah, the Jewish prophet, was speaking on behalf of God, speaking to God's people about the fact that they had turned their backs on God and they were looking for satisfaction and fulfillment and all kinds of other things. And in Isaiah 55:2, it says this, Why spend your money on what is not bread and your labor on what does not satisfy? Listen to me, God says, and eat what is good, and your soul will delight in the richest of fare. This is a picture of addiction. We spend our time and money chasing things we think will satisfy us, but they don't. And they end up trapping us when all along, all we needed to do was to turn and listen to God and allow Him to fill the emptiness on the inside. And I really believe that one of the best safeguards against addiction is just an authentic relationship with the God who created you. Because when your heart is filled with His love and power, then all the empty containers of this world, they don't seem so appealing anymore. So I believe that an authentic relationship with God is the best safeguard against addiction, but I also believe this. I believe it's the only way out of addiction. I believe that addiction can get its claws into you so deeply that there's no way to break free from it without God's help. And I know there are many dimensions to addiction recovery. I know there's psychological dimensions. I know there's a physical aspect to addiction. But I also know there's a spiritual aspect to it that is profoundly important. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a pastor and we're in church. I'm saying that because statistically it is true that those who approach addiction recovery with a strong spiritual component do far, far better than those who try to approach it and conquer addiction without that. It's kind of like our little picture of the bear. There was no way for him to get out of that predicament on his own. He needed help. He needed outside intervention if he was ever going to get free from the thing that would potentially kill him. And addiction is the same way. You may think you can deal with it on your own. You may think you're okay. But the truth is, you've got to come to the point, whether it's a deeply rooted habit or an addiction, you've got to come to the point where you admit that you can't deal with that problem on your own, and you turn to God and you turn to others for help. But here's the problem. Here's the challenge. And we talked about this last week. The challenge is this, that habits and addictions and sin in general carry so much shame that we just don't want anyone to know about it. And so when we're caught in addiction, what we do is we try to hide it. That's why, and no offense intended here, but that's why if you're addicted to something, you got to be a really good liar because you've got to hide it. And so because of our shame, we tend to hide the thing that we're addicted to. And when we hide it, it just gets stronger. And so here's the message today. Here's my point today. If you're struggling with an addiction, or if you're on a pathway toward that, you don't need to hide. You don't need to hide from God. You don't need to hide from others. And you certainly don't need to hide in this church. There is a God who is waiting for you to set you free and give you His power to deal with whatever it is that's holding you down. In fact, I think one of the most important keys to addiction recovery is to reframe our understanding of God. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. There are a couple of ways that you can look at God, okay? When you mess up, when you blow it, when you hit bottom, you can say, I messed up, my dad is going to kill me. Or you can say, I messed up, I need to call my dad. So what is your view of God? Is he this harsh, authoritarian figure who's just waiting to drop the hammer on you every time that you fail? Do you live your life with a sense of shame and guilt that keeps you running in the opposite direction? Or do you look at God through the heart of a good father whose love, which was demonstrated clearly on a cross, whose love and grace are there, who's waiting for you to run to him and not away from him? So today's message in this series is not about how to break bad habits. This is a message about the state of our hearts. Because any effort to break bad habits without changing your heart is doomed to failure. It is short-lived at best. The first thing we have to do is deal with our heart issues. And so today I want to talk about our heart issues, and specifically, I want to talk about how we view God in our hearts and how we respond to our brokenness when we realize it. And so I want to draw our attention to a passage in the Gospel of Luke. This would be the biography of Jesus according to Luke. And here in chapter 14, Jesus tells a story, what we call a parable. And a parable was a simple story with a deep spiritual truth. And Jesus would often teach in these parables as a way of just opening up doors of understanding for some profound truth. There are like 46 parables in the Bible that Jesus told. And this one revolves around food, which is why it's one of my favorites. It's called the parable of the great banquet. And the message behind this parable is simply this: that there is a God who calls to you to step out of your shame and brokenness and to sit down at his banquet table and to eat food that will truly satisfy your soul. So here's how it begins, verse 16. A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. Now, it's important to understand that whenever Jesus told a parable, whenever he told one of these stories, he didn't tell these just for the entertainment value. They were always told to illuminate some kind of spiritual truth, to pull back the curtain and see the heart of God a little bit better. And so in this parable, Jesus is describing God's kingdom. And I love the fact that when Jesus describes God's kingdom and the heart of God, he uses the imagery of a banquet, of a party, an epic party. In fact, this is a fairly common theme that you see throughout Scripture. If you go to the very end of the Bible, there's a book there called the Book of Revelation, and it describes what happens at the end of human history when time comes to an end and all of God's people gather together for what is described as a wedding supper. And in first century Jewish culture, that was like our wedding reception. Except that our wedding receptions are a few hours long. Their wedding supper was 7 days long. It was the most joyous celebration in the Jewish community. And as the father of a daughter who's getting married in 7 weeks, I'm glad ours are 3 hours long, not a week long. But here's what it says at the end of the book of Revelation: let us rejoice and be glad and give him glory for the wedding of the Lamb. And the title Lamb was often used of Jesus in the Bible. For the wedding of the Lamb has come, and his bride, and that title was often used for the church, for us, the bride of Christ, finally coming together at the end of history. For the Lamb has come and his bride has made herself ready. And then it says this: the angel said to me, blessed are those who are invited to the wedding supper of the Lamb, this great banquet, this great celebration. Hundreds of years before this, the prophet Isaiah looked ahead in time, describing this event, actually gives the menu. The Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. I love that last sentence, the best of meats and the finest of wines. Doesn't it make you hungry right now? Like, bad news if you're a vegetarian or a Baptist. And if you're a Baptist vegetarian, that's a real bummer. But for everybody else, it's good. It's not even meant to be taken literally. It's an image. It's the idea of abundance and celebration and community. This is the picture of God's kingdom. In fact, do you know that the very first miracle that Jesus ever performed, according to the Bible, do you know where that very first miracle was performed? At a wedding reception. That's right. He turned water into wine to save the bride's parents from embarrassment. That was the first miracle. And I've often thought, why would he inaugurate his mission as a Messiah? Why would he make his first public appearance and do that miracle? Why not like raise somebody from the dead or at least cure leprosy? Why turn water into wine at a wedding party? I think it was very intentional. It was for this reason, to foreshadow the reason why Jesus had come, to restore our joy, to give us a sense of satisfaction, to bring us together into perfect community. See, this may surprise you. You may have always thought of the church and religion and Christianity as just a set of rules and religious rituals. No. Jesus described it as a party, a banquet. So let me go back to the parable. Verse 16, a certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who had been invited, "Come, for everything is now ready." Now, let me stop and explain what's happening here, because the story can be a bit confusing if you're not familiar with the culture of that day. So in those days, whenever you threw a party, you actually had to give 2 invitations. You would send out the first invitation, and you would say, "Hey, I'm planning a great banquet 3 or 4 weeks from now. Would you want to come?" And then you get the responses. And when you get all the RSVPs, then you know how many people are attending, and then you would put everything into motion. So you would harvest the grain and bake the bread and slaughter the livestock, and there were all kinds of moving pieces to get this done. There were no catering services. And so once it was ready, you would let people know, because again, in that culture, they didn't keep time with clocks and calendars the way we do. So the original invitation would say, "I'm going to have a banquet in, let's say, 3 or 4 weeks. We'll let you know when." And so when everything was almost ready, you would send the servants out again, and they would say this, "Come, for everything is now ready." Okay, so that's where we are in the story. So everything is ready. The table is set. The preparations have been made. It's time to begin the great banquet. But then something shocking happens. The way Jesus tells this story would have been shocking to his listeners, because everybody who had said yes decides at the last minute they're not going to come. Look at verse 18. But they all alike began to make excuses. Now, to say you're going to show up for a party and then not show up, that's bad manners in any culture. But in that culture, it was unthinkable, because this would have been the deepest insult you could ever make. But then, to make matters worse, all of these people come up with like the lamest excuses as to why they can't come. Like the first guy said, "I've just bought a field and I must go see it. Please excuse me." That makes no sense. Who would lay out the cash to buy a piece of property without ever seeing it in the first place? And even if that were true, you can go see it tomorrow. It's dirt. It's not going anywhere. This is the worst excuse ever. And then verse 19. Another said, "I've just bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me." Again, makes no sense. Okay, 5 yoke of oxen, that would be 10 oxen. Huge capital investment in those days. But no one would ever buy oxen without looking at them, making sure they're healthy, and putting the two oxen together in the yoke to make sure they could work together. You wouldn't buy them without doing all of that. You know, it'd be like me saying to you, "Hey, I just bought a car on the internet." And you say, "Oh, that's cool. What make and model? What year? What kind of shape is it in?" "I have no idea. I haven't seen it yet. Don't know anything about it, but I bought it." You know, that would make no sense. This makes no sense. And then the third one, verse 20. Still another said, "I just got married, so I can't come." Like, blame the wife, okay? Again, this makes no sense at all. Like, what wife would not want to dress up, go to a fancy party, and enjoy great food that she did not have to cook? Of course she wants to stay home with you and watch ESPN and eat Doritos, right? Makes no sense. And the point is that all of these excuses, none of them are legitimate, and so the guests cancel, and then to add insult to injury, they just end up giving these really poor excuses. So here's what happens next in the stories. Jesus tells it, verse 21. The servant came back and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry, and he was angry with good cause, because, like I said, in that culture, if you were to do this, this would be deeply insulting. But now he's got a problem. This was a great banquet for a lot of people, so he's got all this food prepared. There was no refrigeration in that day, so it was all going to go to waste. So the owner of the house became angry, and he ordered his servant, "Go out quickly, because everything's ready. Go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame." And again, this would have sounded shocking to the listeners in that day, because wealthy, powerful people did not invite these people into their homes, into their parties. So the servant goes to the back alleys and the gutters, and he takes this invitation to the beggars and the nobodies and the outcasts of society, the people who never get invited to a party. And then this, the servant comes back, verse 22, "Sir," the servant said, "what you ordered has been done, but there is still room." Then the master told his servant, "Go out to the roads and country lanes and compel them to come in." He says, go beyond the city limits, go from farm to farm, find anybody you can find, even if they're strangers, and invite them to come. Compel them to come. It says that doesn't mean force them to show up. It means this. Here's what the master understood. That given this invitation, these people would say, "No way. He's rich. I'm poor. He's powerful. I'm nobody. I mean, he can't really be serious about this invitation. I mean, I appreciate the gesture, but that's no party that I would ever go to." And so the master says, when they politely smile and say no, you ask again and again and again so that my house will be full. Now, whenever you read a parable, you can't just read it intellectually. You have to read it emotionally as well. You got to put yourself into the story. So imagine being one of these beggars, one of these strangers, one of these outcasts who finds himself sitting in a banquet hall, sitting in a chair he never thought he would occupy in his lifetime, eating food he never thought he would ever get the chance to taste. I mean, how would that feel? I think this had to be a really, really fun party. Like, this would not be one of those formal, stuffy events with tables filled with well-dressed, uptight people. This would be a party, because nobody appreciates a banquet like a beggar. I love this story. There was a news story last year that kind of parallels this. There was a young lady by the name of Sarah Cummings. She lives in the Indianapolis area, and her wedding day was approaching. She was a week away from her wedding day when she and her fiance decided to call it off. And being a week away from her wedding day, they had already obviously booked the reception, and they had a non-refundable contract for a $30,000 dinner for 170 guests. So Sarah, the bride, decided to go ahead with the party, but with a whole different guest list. She invited 170 homeless people from the city of Indianapolis. On the day of the party, they sent out 5 buses to homeless shelters around the city and brought all of these people to the Ritz-Campbell in Indianapolis. And on the day of the party, they had a 4-course meal, they drank champagne, they ate wedding cake, and they danced late into the night. Homeless people at $160 a plate dinner. Do you know what that is? It's a picture of grace. And the word grace simply means unmerited favor. It means being given something that you did not deserve and could never earn. And this parable that Jesus tells, it's a picture of grace. It's a picture of what we call the message of the gospel. And the good news of the gospel is this, that all of us are broken, poor, powerless people who've been invited to a banquet that we could never afford and that we don't deserve. That's the parable of the great banquet. Now, what was the message behind it? When Jesus told this story, when he told this parable, what was he seeking to communicate? Well, first of all, I think there are 2 messages. There was a message for the audience that heard it there in the moment, and then there's a message that rings out across the centuries still today. The message to those in the room, because if you look at verse 1 and you see the context of chapter 14, Jesus actually told this story at a dinner party. It says he went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee. And the Pharisees were the religious leaders of that day. They were highly respected, well put together pillars of society. And so Jesus tells this parable because when he came on the scene, he had offered an invitation. The invitation was this: follow me. And the religious leaders should have been the first ones to respond to that invitation. Jewish prophets had been pointing to this moment. The scriptures described the coming Messiah. But when the invitation came, all these religious leaders made up all these excuses because they were self-righteous and prideful and stubborn. And so guess who came to the party? Guess who followed Jesus? The tax collectors and the prostitutes and the outcasts of society. And the religious people hated that. And so Jesus tells them this parable to help them understand why this was true. But then there's a message for you and me as well, a message that rings out across the centuries. And the message is simply this: you have received an invitation. You have received an invitation. See, the cross is an invitation. That's what it is. We often think of the cross as a decoration, like we put it on jewelry. And we put it on church buildings. And at Easter, you can actually buy your kids a chocolate cross for their Easter basket. Explain to them you're giving them a chocolate instrument of execution. We think of the cross as a decoration. It was never meant to be a decoration. It's an invitation. It's God saying to you, the price has been paid. The door is open. There's a seat at my table for you. So I want to talk to three groups of people in closing. First of all, some of you may need to simply respond to this invitation, to respond to God's grace. See, there were people in this parable who received the invitation, then they ignored it. And that may describe some of you. Maybe you've been coming to church here for a while, and now you understand the message. You understand what it means to be a follower of Christ. And you're beginning to understand that, but you haven't responded to that message yet. You're ignoring it. Let me say this. There are some invitations that are way too important to just ignore. There are. Last year, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, they got married, There was a huge mistake. I don't know if you know this or not. There was a huge mistake when the wedding invitations went out, a mistake for which Buckingham Palace has yet to apologize. And I'm referring to the fact that I did not get my invitation to that. And so if any of the royal family are listening online right now, I'm still waiting for that apology. But imagine if you're somebody living in Great Britain and you get the invitation to this wedding. And you say, bummer, I'd like to go, but I got these oxen I got to check out. Like I got this land, this dirt I got to go look at. Sorry, I can't make it. I mean, that would be preposterous. There are some invitations that demand to be taken seriously. You've received an invitation from the creator of the universe. The price has been paid, the door is open, there's a seat at the table. It's not a summons, it's not a demand, it's an invitation. Later in the Bible, in the book of Revelation, Jesus is speaking. He says it this way: I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and what? And eat with that person. It's a sign of intimate fellowship, friendship, acceptance. Eat with that person and they with me. There is an invitation that's been extended, yet some of you have ignored it. Maybe you think, you're pretty well put together. You don't really need God. It's humbling to think that you need someone to save you from anything, including sin. Maybe you're just busy and you're too busy with life to worry about spiritual things. Let me tell you what, at some point you will no longer be busy. You'll be dead. And at that point, the moment of responding to the invitation will be over. But maybe, just maybe, you feel like you've made too many mistakes. But what was the point of this whole parable that Jesus told? The point was this, that the invitation is for all of us. Doesn't matter how far you've wandered. Doesn't matter how deeply you've fallen. Doesn't matter how many mistakes you've made, because in God's eyes, no one is too sinful, too scarred, too screwed up, or too far away. The invitation is open. And if you've never responded to it before, I want to give you a chance right now in just a moment of time in this service to do that. And here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Everybody in the room, just kind of close your eyes and tune out the people around you. But maybe in this moment, you want to reach out and accept that gift of grace. You want to respond to that invitation. All you have to do, it's like an RSVP to a wedding. You check a box, you put it in the mail, the stamp was already on it. You say yes, you open that door. Pray a simple prayer in your own words, something like this right now in the quietness of your seat. Lord, I recognize that I am broken. I'm an outsider. I'm a beggar. spiritually and morally. Thank you for grace. Thank you for the cross. Thank you for the promise of satisfaction in this life and life in eternity with you. Today, I accept that invitation for Jesus to be the forgiver of my sin and the leader of my life. Amen. In a room this size, I'm pretty confident that there were maybe one or several people who prayed a prayer like that. If that's the case, and I believe it is, I think we ought to just celebrate that. Just celebrate that. Because it is humbling sometimes to acknowledge some of those things. So some of us, we just need to respond to God's grace, and maybe for you that will be outside of this church service. But you may need to show God's grace. Maybe there's somebody in your life who just needs you to display that same grace toward them. If you've been in church for a while, you've been a Christian for a while, that's a good thing. Here's the downside. Over time, you can easily begin to become proud and judgmental and forget that none of us deserve a place at the table. Maybe there's somebody in your life who's struggling. Maybe they're struggling with an addiction, and they've made a lot of mistakes, and they've done damage to themselves and other people, and you're angry, and you try to lecture them, and you try to shame them into changing. Probably you just drive them deeper into the addiction because you compound the shame. Maybe what they need from you is grace. And by the way, showing grace does not mean enabling bad behavior. Does not mean excusing what they're doing. It means this. It means you say, I still love you. There is still value in you. And there is still hope for you. And there is a God who is waiting. There's a place at his table, a place where you can sit down and find the food that ultimately satisfies your soul. Maybe you need to show grace to somebody. But I think many of us here just need to do this. We just need to remember God's grace because we forget. Over time, the memory fades. And we forget that none of us were on the A list for the party. None of us deserve to be at that table. And in the moment when you first realize that, it's in the words of that old hymn, it's amazing grace. In your brokenness, when you find forgiveness in the promise of eternity, that's amazing grace. It's hard to believe. Do you know what happens over time? Amazing grace kind of becomes intriguing grace. And then it's interesting grace. And eventually it's grace. It's just a theological word. See, I don't know how long it's been since you came to that realization and you embraced that grace, but I hope you still find it amazing, because here's what I've discovered in my own heart and in the hearts of other people. Whenever you see a Christian who's proud and judgmental and joyless, it's because they've forgotten. So here's what we're going to do as we wrap up. I want to give you a way to drive this home in your own heart, and a way to really engage in this truth that Jesus taught. So on your chair when you came in was a card that looks like this. Go ahead and grab it. Get your hands on it. Grab the pen that was with it. Hold it in front of you. It's a little tent card. It unfolds like this. And you would typically see these at like a wedding reception or a really nice banquet, okay? So you walk in and you find these cards. And what are you looking for on this card? You're looking for your name. Because if you see your name, then you know you actually were invited, that they wanted you there, that you have a place at a table out there, and so you find your name, and then you're like, yes, I can party, okay? So here's what I want you to do. If there was a point in your life when you understood and embraced the truth that we've talked about today, if there was a moment in your life when you said, I'm an outcast, I'm a beggar, but there's grace for me, and you accepted Jesus Christ as your forgiver of sin, the leader of your life, I want you to do this in your fanciest handwriting possible. Put your first and last name on that card, okay? If maybe today you're realizing that truth and embracing that truth for the very first time, maybe even prayed a prayer of your own a few minutes ago, on the other side of that, just put today's date. If today was the first time and is the first time you're believing this. Now here's what we're going to do. I'm going to have the band come on back up. They're going to close with one more song, very powerful song. Don't go anywhere. But after I get done talking here in just a minute, we'll watch a brief video, and after that video is over, the band's going to just begin playing. As they begin to play, here's what I want to encourage you to do. Get up out of your seat and take that card and bring it to one of these two tables at the very front of the room. And just take that place card and set it on the table. as a way of remembering, as a tangible way of reminding yourself, I have a place at the table, not because I'm so good, not because of anything I've done to earn a place at that table, but because of God's grace, because of the cross. Now, if you're still trying to sort all this out and you're not really a Christian yet as far as you believe, that's okay. Just sit and process and watch all of this. But for the rest of us, let's make this a sacred moment of worship as we celebrate God's love and grace and the place He's given us at His banquet table, where we find the food that ultimately satisfies our hearts. So as the band sets up, just watch this with me.